I usually advise candidates to take risks in job interviews, especially with high-performing companies. For example, if you have a failure that in the beginning you don't feel comfortable talking about, then the more you practice it, the more likely you'll be comfortable talking about in a job interview, especially if you feel like the interview is not going your way. And the same goes, with weaknesses. I believe that it's very important that you find a weakness that is your true weakness, and you become good at selling yourself on that weakness as being a differentiator in the job interview. I coached sales candidates talking about communication as not being one of their strengths, and I also coached technical candidates who said that some technical ability was one of their weaknesses, but because of the fact they managed to convince the interviewer, they were confident about being the right candidate for the job, and more importantly, of being able to ramp up their performance to their expectations, they actually landed job offers. Now, there's all sorts of weaknesses, but there's this weakness of not being good at interviewing in job interviews that I find probably the weakness that I would never be able to sell myself on in a job interview. And the more I think about it, the more I actually believe that it's actually slightly disrespectful to say this in a job interview, simply because, if you're not happy with how the process of getting into that company, then why do you apply for that role in the first place, right? So I believe that saying that you're not good in job interviews is definitely not the right way to go, and probably one of the worst weaknesses I've ever heard. If you think about it, maybe not. It's not that your interviewer do their job because they like interviewing you. In fact, the people that like interviewing the most in these high-performing companies are called bar raisers. So they are incentivized to interview people. But I believe it's slightly disrespectful to say that I'm not good at job interviewing as being one of your weaknesses. Now, on slightly more constructive side of things, how can you find the best weakness? What are some of the methods that you can find these weaknesses? First, here's a couple of examples that you might want to use. Maybe you find something that's you can really relate to, but more often than not, this is rather a process than a one-time thing. So you might find something today that you might think hey, this one seems to be good, but then after 3 days you might change your mind. You might find an even better one. A method that I found worked particularly well, and this is for Amazon interviews, but I believe you could use it for any interview for that matter, is to take Amazon's 14 leadership principles, which are actually behaviors, and to see which of those behaviors you connect the least with. For example, I coached a candidate he was a scientist that I noticed, while I was role-playing with them on the leadership principle of have backbone, disagree, and commit, he was simply not capable of finding the right type of examples. He came up with an example such as he found an error and he presented that into a meeting. But when I followed up with him, he said that he ended up fixing that error himself because he couldn't convince the others to help him in resolve that issue. So in this case, that candidate was weak in have backbone, disagree, and commit, and imposing his point of view was one of their weaknesses. So long as he had a good pitch for that weakness, he did quite well in that job interview. So again, if you take those 14 behaviors, leadership principles, then you might find something that that you're not the perfect candidate for. And if you manage to find an example from your career where you exhibited that weakness that is also relatively recent, then I believe this is also an excellent way for you to spot your weakness. Now, I would very much stay away from the generic types of weakness, the public speaking and the being a perfectionist in job interviews, except if you feel like the interview is going so very much to your favor, which from experience in behavioral interviews, that this very rarely happens. But the maximum you can do with a generic weakness is to be a so-so candidate. Another scenario it's very likely here is that they would ask you first for a weakness, which if generic, they would ask you for a second weakness. Right? So it could also be like this. Also, I found candidates who actually felt quite comfortable coming up with weaknesses, and they would prefer to come up with 3 weaknesses and say, hey, I have these 3 weaknesses. Which one would you like me to develop more on any of these? So this is also a possible scenario. But in my opinion, you should always take these questions as opportunities to sell yourself as good as possible in these job interviews. So hopefully you found this interesting, and thank you very much for watching.